when I first started reading comics, I never really thought about company crossovers or anything like that. The idea never popped in my head. Um, but as I mentioned in a couple of other videos, or at least one other video, that one of the things that started to trigger me thinking of the big two, Marvel and DC, of course, actually doing something together, came about as a result of um, um, two different kinds of materials. One was a comic book, and the other was an art book based largely on comics. The comic book was Not Brand Etch, and for those that remember, Not Brand Etch was kind of I don't know if it was ever big, but it was most notable in the 60s, maybe going a little bit into the 70s, and it was essentially a parody book where you would have, instead of Captain America, there'd be Charlie America, there'd be the Human Scourge, there'd be Nat Man, because they would occasionally parody DC superheroes too. Wonder Woman, Superman, but usually they would stick with the Marvel stuff. I believe that's where Four Bush Man kind of originated, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, that was one of the deals that got me to start thinking of, what if Marvel and DC actually had done something together. The other thing was Neil Adams had a couple of art books out. He's had quite a few, but the couple that I'm talking about, they were art books that both had on the cover, on their respective covers, Marvel and DC heroes facing each other. The first one was basically your classic. One team on one side, the other team on the other side, and in the middle, Neil Adams had what appeared to be like a parody of Mighty Mouse that was keeping both of these company franchises from going head to head with one another. So finally, Marvel and DC in the mid to late 70s, I think it was 76, 77, if I remember what HowlerMouse had said correctly. It was somewhere around that time where Superman and Spider-Man got together in a Treasury edition. And while I was ecstatic about the two companies actually putting stuff together, thematically, I thought those two characters didn't really work. Now, arguably, you could say that both of them being in the news business would be the tie that binds, so to speak. But aesthetically, from a power level, you would think it would be something like Superman and Hulk or Superman and Thor. But given that Spider-Man was the flagship title for Marvel, I'm guessing pretty much that was the reason why they started with Spider-Man. And with Superman, it was obvious. But as I recall it, the Superman and Spider-Man thing was pretty much boring. The sequel was maybe slightly better, but nothing to write home about. Then there was Batman and Hulk, and that battle was the way it was constructed. was fairly implausible. But what saved it was the art of Jose Garcia Lopez, and his draftsmanship made it a very aesthetically excuse me, a very aesthetically pleasing book to the eye. But there were things that happened in there that even if you suspend your belief, you have a hard time believing that Batman could do some of the things he did as it relates to the Hulk. But nonetheless, like I was saying, it was an attractive book. But still, it was not a book that you would say was a landmark in terms of its overall quality. And then, if I'm not getting the chronology wrong, I think the next book that was done after Superman and Spider-Man, the sequel, and Batman and Hulk, I believe came the first Marvel and DC deal that was not a Treasury edition, and that was Teen Titans X-Men, which was kind of a no-brainer to put these two teams together. What was questionable was having the artists on there that they did. Now, Walt Simonson, I think, is spectacular, especially from a design point of view. But it was very questionable as to why they put him on this particular title. Especially when at the time, if memory serves correctly, George Perez was coming into his own with Teen Titans, and John Byrne was doing likewise with X-Men. Although I don't have the same affinity for Byrne's work as I do Perez's work, I do know that he was like the hot item at the time, and to have neither one of these guys artistically on their respective projects is, to me, really befuddling. Had I been able to be empowered, I would like to think that they would have had both John Byrne and George Perez on there. Have one pencil one half of the book, have the other pencil the other half of the book, and then have each of them be each other's anchors. That, I think, would have been the way to go. Now, the book wasn't horrible. It just wasn't it just didn't lend itself to Walt Simonson style, I should say. And then, later on, the one book that I think that they were starting to get it a little bit right, even though it wasn't exceptional, and this is some time down the road, but it was with Green Lantern and Silver Surfer. And this is with Kyle Rayner as Green Lantern. Now, that book just felt right. It wasn't particularly great. It wasn't groundbreaking or anything like that. But I think it was, at the time, before anything else later would come out, it was at the time probably the best of the Marvel DC crossovers. I think the most notable one, while just not quite being exceptional, but being pretty darn decent, I think, was Justice League and the Avengers. I know that George Perez, it's been George Perez's baby for up to 20 years, if not longer. And to see this book finally coming to his own, I thought was, while not quite a masterstroke, was definitely something worth the wait. And given that I'm not very big on time travel and interdimensional type stories, the Justice League Avengers story, I think worked, and I think it worked well. Excuse me, I think it worked well, and to have the characters in DC be, in comparison to the characters in Marvel, be sort of the snide ones, sort of the elitist type, while the Avengers were more the working class hero type. I think, was handled pretty well, and I really don't have any complaints about the book, except that I wish it was released when it was initially intended to be released. While Perez's work wouldn't have been as polished back then, I think it would have been more energized back then. But anyway, that's going to wrap up this part of the company crossovers chat that I'm putting out. The next part will be more along the lines of what each company has done in terms of doing homages to the other companies' heroes and whatnot, and plus still a little bit more on the whole crossover deal. So until next time, I'll just say night out.